Zari and Marc Faddoul, and they're from the high school at Berkeley, and I will get out of their way. Oh, and Rebecca Johnson will be commenting.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity to present our work here. My name is Marc, and our work also focuses on pretrial algorithmic risk assessment. So we're hoping it will feel like a natural continuation of the topics previously heard, because we're particularly interested in one of the questions that was raised at the end, which is the interaction of the human and the tool. So we're very much looking forward to your feedback on that. Just to start with a little bit of background on the policy context, we're all aware of the high pre-trial incarceration rates in the U.S. It's at 21.6% across the nation, and in California, which is what we focus on, there are actually 63% of detainees that neither pled guilty to a crime nor were convicted of a crime. And so this has fueled a larger demand for criminal justice reform, and across the nation we're seeing this broader trend toward algorithmic justice, with more and more states either authorizing or requiring the use of risk assessment tools, so that at present 1 in 4 Americans lives in a jurisdiction that uses a risk assessment tool. And in California specifically, last August, the state legislature passed Senate Bill 10, which mandates the move from a cash bail system to a risk assessment tool-based system. And so at the moment, there are a number of different systems that are used across California, but the only tool that seems to pass the validation requirements set out in the bill at the moment is the public safety assessment that was developed by the nonprofit Laura and Arnold Foundation. So this is what we focus on. And just a little bit of a note on the status of the bill at the moment. Its entry into force is pending because it was challenged and put on the 2020 ballot as a veto referendum, so that the Californians to decide that before we go enter into force. But that doesn't change our work. We're focusing on the functional handoff from in pretrial decision making from a cash bail system with just a judge to a risk assessment system. And the questions we're interested in are: what are the benefits and limitations of the PSA in its current implementation? What socio-tactical challenges and value conflicts emerge, and how can we use these insights to design an alternative system that addresses these limitations and makes them transparent? So the methods we use include theoretical approaches by applying the handoff model and stakeholder interviews that we conducted, which then informed our design of our alternative model. And the stakeholder interviews covered a broad range of experts, from criminal justice and civil liberties advocacy to legal practitioners and an algorithmic bias expert. And something we particularly enjoyed and found very, very insightful was the interviews that we conducted with previously convicted individuals who had, based on their long sentences, extensive lived experience with the criminal justice system and the pretrial detention decision itself. So that was very, very interesting, and these are just some impressions from these interviews. Something that Marc has already mentioned earlier was that one of the things we learned in the interviews was that a lot of the factors that the defendants identify as important in the pretrial detention decision are of a qualitative, contextual nature that is actually not captured in the tools that were often used for risk assessment. And with that, we want to move into the theoretical analysis of our tool, the PSA. And for that, we use the handoff model, which was developed by Deirdre Mulligan and Helen Nissenbaum. And it is a tool to highlight and emphasize the values implications, not just as limitations, but also as something that could be promoted by a technical tool in the situation where we delegate decision-making from a human to a tool. And so what they really clarify conceptually is the goal, purpose, function, and how of the system. And in our case, with the system being pretrial decision-making, the goal, or what the system hopes to achieve, is to ensure that the defendant does not appear in court and that they do not pose a danger to the community. The purpose, or why it wants to achieve that, is to maintain public order, which includes both a fair trial and sentence and public safety, preventing further crime. The function of what it is actually doing to achieve that goal is to assess available information, to assess the risk of somebody failing to appear in court to commit a new crime. And now what we're really interested in is the how, because that is what's different in the configuration before and after the handoff. So before, the situation involved a human actor, the judge, who had information about the defendant in question at an individual level and similar defendants based on their professional experience in aggregate. What they did was select and weigh relevant pieces of information, make a decision, and justify a decision. And now, post-Senate Bill 10 in the new hand of configuration, we started by having human actors, the court staff, who enter information about a defendant into the system. And that's important because it's a source of error, both intentional and unintentional, and we're happy to discuss that later. But what then happens is that the technical actor, the algorithm, weighs these factors, and they're usually binary or numerical variables. In the case of the PSA, the technical actor calculates risk scores and then converts those to a 6-point scale. And that is when the human actor, the judge, again enters the picture. They have all the information they had in the pre-handoff situation, as well as the risk assessment results and interpretation guidance to make a justified decision. So what that looks like is like this. We have two different scores presented here, transparently highlighting what factors went into those scores, and then most importantly this framework matrix that depicts the failure to appear score and the new criminal activity score, and then based on the combination of these factors makes a release or do not release interpretation, guidance, recommendation to the judge. So the value implications that we found in this handoff and this technical delegation are a number. So first of all, we have found problematic the accuracy. The model is simplistic in a number of ways, both because contextual information is not included, but also by the way it is specified. We have quite substantial threshold effects. So the 1H cutoff, for example, that's included in the model is at 23. And being on either side of that cutoff changes your risk score by almost 30%, which is quite substantial. And also the assumption of linearity is quite a strong assumption because that is making assumptions of how all these complicated variables interact with each other. And that leads to the next question, which is the accountability for the information contained in that recommendation, because it is presented as a recommendation based on data, so as a data-driven, evidence-based assessment, but there are also elements of the tool, which we call automatic overrides or step 2 exclusions, which basically default the recommendation to a do not release recommendation for certain charges. So murder charge, for example, would automatically default the defendant to do not release. And that's important because in a very personal murder case, for example, that being a murderer may not mean that you're a danger to the community just because that personal situation played out a certain way. So there are important things to consider around that. Leading to a broader question of transparency, we do not have publicly available information about the data set, the model used to infer the weights attached to these variables, and how the interpretation guidance was established. And then last but not least, we want to address the fairness proposition. We have found through outside research that the tool is calibrated, but we are missing an explicit discussion of which fairness proposition was chosen in the trade-off between different fairness propositions that could be available. And that leads us to our biggest point that we see as problematic, which is the lack of critical engagement on the part of legal professionals with the tools. So what we found in our expert interviews is that there seems to be a lack of understanding and therefore ability to challenge the tool. And so what we see as critical is that if we have a given defendant that has a score of 6 on the FTA scale and 6 on the new criminal activity scale and ends up in this red box, which through a political decision was assigned a do not release recommendation, what does it actually mean? What does the judge understand the algorithm to do, and what does it actually do? And that's sort of what I have tomorrow.
Well, we're actually going to ask you that very question. So, if you had to guess, what would you say is the maximal score for failure to appear? If someone gets this maximal score, what is the actual rate at which they will fail to appear? Yeah?
40%.
40%?
20%?
I mean, so this means 80% of false positive, right?
Yeah.
For the maximum fault. Well, you're not bad. this is what's happening right now. 26% for 5 out of 6, 6 out of 6, 68% of false positive. So for new criminal activity, even worse. And for new violent criminal activity, we get to more than 95% of false positive. And this, I think, can be like thought about. I think it's really crazy. Like considering the consequences of like an individual life of like retaining someone who has not been charged yet, and I mean it definitely brings up a lot of very intricate ethical questions, and which are not engineering questions, but more like policy and ethical questions as to whether you put this threshold. But these things are hard to defend to me. Then I think this is the most crucial part that is missing in the PSA is some considerations about error rates. And not just in terms of the disparities of these error rates across groups, which has been brought up a lot, calibration and fairness proposition, but just in absolute terms, what do these error rates are. So it's important to note that the PSA looks at pre-trial risk assessment, so it's not like assessing recidivism over 2 years, but rather just for a couple of months. So this means that the number of true positive is much lower, which means that it's harder to identify them, and that's why you get so much more false positive. So the class imbalance is stronger. So this is the core of our alternative design goal. We think it's important to keep in mind that judges are typically not trained as data scientists, so they may not be instructed to be critical about this result. And the capacity of error rates actually fuels the AI mythology, which overstates the power of these prediction tools. And our interview showed that actually a lot of judges consider this tool a silver bullet somehow, and what counts more than what the algorithm does is what the judge thinks that the algorithm does, and there seems to be a big discrepancy between his expectation and reality. So our alternative design is based on a decision tree. We think it's a good choice, or even choice for a couple of reasons. First, we want to provide local error rates because local in the space of the representation feature, because we don't really care about the overall precision, but rather how this very specific defendant that we're talking about is being considered. There is no reason to assume linearity either in the impacts of each specific feature, nor in how they interact with each other. And so this allows to capture, the decision tree would capture rather complex patterns while remaining. So this is what it looks on a little toy example that we ran on, guess what, the campus data set that we've seen already a lot of times today. But we brought it up again because the PSA did not give us surrender yet in giving us the data, so we hope they will eventually. So if we run the defendant through this tree, it will end up in 4 boxes potentially. So if it ends up in the first, for example, the 69% one, we want to give it a high-risk recommendation and also provide this actual rate to the judge. If it ends up in this one, it's a low risk, so we can also say low risk and give a 30%. If it ends up in one of these two things, well, we believe it's better actually to do nothing. Like you don't do a recommendation at all, you withhold from it, and you just delegate fully the decision to the judge. Because like there's no point in making a highly noisy prediction, which would eventually just give reason to be misinterpreted. So this is what it looks if we look at it on a 2D graph. It's actually interesting because this morning it was mentioned that the compass accuracy can be obtained by only keeping 2 features, which are failure to appear and age of defendant. So here we see that you would have like, so this is only with 2 boxes and we'll get a more complex tree, but you see that some region are like, the gray one or the noisy one. And you can make it with more boxes, which by making the tree deeper. So this is the output from the algorithm, but here is like what it looks if you make it a little bit deeper. Here, the more colorful the box is, the better the precision is, and the more gray means the less there is. And I see that the deeper the tree gets, the more granularity we can get in this precision rate. And this would actually lower the threshold effects that were mentioned this morning. And actually, if you end up
I think it
You
does
just
work.
can't.
Does that work?
You just point.
okay, so well, if here you end up being just below the split, for example, well, you're probably going to end up in one of these redder boxes. And if here you end up on the other side, you're just above, then you'll probably end up here in one of the bluer, probably similar color, whichever side of the split you end up. You can see that at different levels of it. So the deeper it is, the less these threshold effects will become relevant. But of course, you don't want to make it too deep either, because then you don't have enough samples in each bucket. So these are all like important design choices that need to be made, and so they involve overfitting, treatment disparity, precision, also the handout threshold, at which level do we decide to hand out to the judge. It doesn't have, and it's probably better not to be the same for high risk and low risk, especially because there's a high imbalance in the classes. It may appear more complex than the simpler approach taken by the PSA, but we believe that it's necessary for this trade-off to be made transparent and explicit, and also translated into value implication instead of just technical language, because these tussles are inherent to data science, and it's what is going to make the model fair and accurate. So, in terms of general benefits of this model, we see that by withholding from doing predictions that are excessively noisy, you will get a better accuracy. Also because it's less simplistic in terms of the threshold and the splits. We can also give the judge the decision path so that some features can be reinterpreted in the light of contextual elements. And also, it's an purely empirically based prediction tool, and the tool doesn't actually make a recommendation. It's not going to say release or detain like Compass is doing. It's just giving a rate of potential, right? And I think it's an important distinction, because it's not for the algorithm to decide whether it should be detained or released. It should just be empirical evidence. And so if we assume that the tree is well calibrated and that the judge actually is going to account for this risk assessment in a roughly linear way in the rate with which they're going to make the retain or the release or detain decisions, we believe that it could actually, in a way, reduce or offset inherent trade-off between fairness of outcome and fairness of treatment. And this would be done by adding this sort of balance notion in the recommendation. And we'd love to have some of your feedback on that.
Yeah, so I'll be quick because I know there'll be a lot of good discussions. So thanks so much for sharing the paper. So I'm first going to highlight what I think are some really exciting parts of the paper and then some opportunities for discussion. So I think a couple of highlights, especially in relevance to what we've been discussing thus far in the conference, are it really puts the question about when we ought to even delegate decisions to technology at all at the forefront. In particular, with our discussions of something like pretrial detention, our justice system obviously has a choice between allowing human judges to continue to make these decisions with whatever mental model of risk they're using that's fairly non-transparent, or overriding those human judgments with the results of a risk assessment model or an algorithm. And related to the discussion yesterday and ideas about procedural justice, I think you guys do a great job of highlighting that if I'm a defendant and I'm objecting to the fairness of some process used to make my pretrial detention decision, I might have two general classes of objections. One class of objections is related to subgroup fairness. So I might be able to say that as a member of subgroup A, this decision was unfair relative to the decision that would have been made if I was a member of subgroup B, and that A and B are, a morally irrelevant characteristic like race. And so you guys point to that as sort of this discussion of subgroup accuracy and fairness.
and that being very well developed already. But I think you guys introduced an important point that in addition to subgroup fairness, there's sort of just general accuracy and fairness. So the question being, when we're looking at the shift to a risk assessment tool or another technological system making a decision, when can we say that performance is so bad for people with certain attributes that the decision ought to still be made by humans? And I think you guys raised the interesting question about different burdens of proof for technological decisions versus human decisions. And maybe decisions are very bad, maybe they're biased, maybe they're highly inaccurate, but maybe we ought to have a higher standard for technological decisions. And so this idea of shifting to human decisions when technological decisions fall below that threshold, and maybe different thresholds for humans versus technology. I think another thing that the paper highlights well is that the criminal justice system is not sort of a homogeneous set of actors. There are different actors with different preferences, and those actors might weight different types of errors differently. So I think you guys do a good job of highlighting that. Obviously, defendants care about things like false positives, they care about unjust detention, but judges, when thinking about the use of these tools, are thinking about false negatives and people being released who then go on to commit a crime that makes it into the local paper. And even if that's at a really low rate, like 3 or 4%, there's selective media attention of those cases, and so there might be the sort of biased weighting of errors where judges rate that type of error very high compared to other stakeholders. So a couple different discussions to get us started. So I think it's interesting, this idea of, depending on defendants' values for certain attributes, they fall into one of 3 categories. So they either have a point estimate of high risk, and we're relatively confident in that point estimate. They have a point estimate of low risk, and we're relatively confident in that point estimate. Or they might have a point estimate in either bucket, but there's a lot of uncertainty around that point estimate. So you guys sort of propose one way to shade the boxes gray, which I think is related to the rates of recidivism in that bucket. But I guess you can think about other ways that I think you guys alluded to also in the talk. It's just like how many people are used in that bucket. So even if it's a high rate, if it's calculated on very few individuals, there's more uncertainty around that point estimate. Another way to maybe decide who falls into a gray box related to earlier discussions is, rather than just looking at someone's predicted risk under one model, so like within the decision tree model, sort of calculating their rank within a lot of different models, like decision tree, random forest, like lasso, regularization, etc. And maybe depending on the variance in that rank, if there's a lot of variance in their ranked risk according to all these different models, we might be less confident in that prediction. But if there's minimal variance and they're always ranked as high risk across a bunch of different models, we might be more confident. So it's just like thinking about different ways to operationalize that gray box. And then this didn't come up in the presentation as much in the paper, but you guys talk about how it's really important in this context to think about what label we're modeling when we're analyzing recidivism. And in particular, if one of the labels we're modeling is failure to appear, can we separate people into 2 subgroups? There's people whose failure to appear is related to sort of logistical constraints that they're plausibly blameless for, like, it was scheduled and they couldn't get out of their shift and stuff like that, versus is their failure to appear a bit more sinister and they're sort of deliberately avoiding court. So I think I mentioned verbally, but I thought one interesting way to get at this empirically is they've done, like the crime lab did a study where they randomized people to either receive like help with the logistical constraints or no help with those logistical constraints. And it had really strong average effects, but I'm guessing different effects in different subgroups. And so you might find the subgroup that has the largest treatment effect. And those are the people whose failure to appear is sort of plausibly blameless or could be attributed maybe to these logistical constraints, versus a subgroup who, even if you help them a lot with these logistics, they still don't show up, and that that subgroup might be the label that we're trying to model. So like whether you could bring in the literature on heterogeneous treatment effects to sort of separate these two subgroups. But yeah, it's super interesting, and yeah, I'm excited for the discussion.
Yeah, actually the last Actually, we're really, really grateful for that last comment, because that is also something that we have been thinking about, because it would have to be a labeling with a training data set, but you would have to go back to all these hundreds of thousands of individuals and suss out whether or not their failure to appear was intentional. So that's really hard to do. So
yeah, so I think the RCT would be really to share it would be cool. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. Because I also believe that it would be what it should be happening is like how they're going to show up, but it's very hard to get this good data set. So fantastic. About the design part, there is definitely a lot of things I wish we could have talked more about. So one extension we sort of was to move it to a handoff forest.
Yeah.
And there is definitely increasing accuracy. You would increase also blur the threshold effects even more, so you can have like some knowledge about where you split, and so get. But the trade-off is with interpretability, of course. Because then here, well, the kind of nice thing is that you can then use the past to a judge, and even if there's several split on age, for example, we'll give the retained age was between 38 and 43, and then it can then be like. With a random forest would be harder to do that, but I believe it'd be better. Since like against all the value choices. And again, when you said about how can people interpret the fact that they're in one box or another, I think a really interesting discussion is to be made as to whether there are some splits that are preferable to make than other depending on what the feature actually means. For example, I don't know if it's great to split on age personally. Like, is it really what we want to judge people on? And it's a hard question, but again, it's not shouldn't necessarily just be based on how much entropy can you get rid of by just doing the split. It may be more, is it really what you want? So we could weight features differently and give it some preference ranking as to what we want the split to be made of. But yeah, there's lots of little tweaks that could be played around with. And I think, and this is a very simple model, and that even by building this very simple paradigm, we see all this very subtle tussle that happens in every single design decision. And so when then we see that Compass and PSA both have a completely opaque system that we have no idea how to build, that's where we realize, like how did they make this choice? Look, they must have made them at some point.